Thank you so much for that lovely welcome, Madonna. It's really great to be here. I never thought in a million years that I'd be delighted to be leaving the sweltering heat of England to come to the cold in Melbourne. There's nothing new under the sun, or is there? I would like first to start by thanking most sincerely the Australian Institute of Family Studies, and in particular Anne and Kelly and Nancy, for the care they've taken in preparing me and looking after me in the run-up to this conference. At the break, I'll tell you about my journey. It was eventful. I also would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're on today. And, okay, so let's start. Protecting children, time for a new story. I want to start by saying that the question mark is important. It actually signals that I'm here. I want to persuade you that we need a new story, but I also want to have a conversation with you. I want to enter into dialogue. I want us to talk together about what's going on. Because unfortunately, I am old enough to know that we've had many false dawns in child protection. We've had many messiahs. We've had many new stories. We've had many, oh, this will solve it. This will sort it out. And I am worried and anxious, as indeed my colleagues that I work with and the families I work with on the journey that we've been on over the last few years. I'm worried and anxious that I will contribute to even more disillusionment and disappointment. However, I want to, and I intend to, and I do travel hopefully. As the Bulgarian writer Maria Popova has said, critical thinking without hope is cynicism, but hope without critical thinking is naivety. So my thoughts to you come from a place of both critical thinking, but crucially of hope. I think that we can do better than we're doing. That is not a disrespect to the people who work so hard, the people who care so much, and the enormous amounts of effort and goodwill that go in. But I think we can do better for families, and I think we will do better if we interrogate some of our really fundamental assumptions. I'm not talking about tweaking. I'm not talking about little bits and pieces of change here and there, although they matter, and they matter enormously to families, and they matter to people every day, and I will be telling you about some of those. But I think we need to go back to basics and have a look at some of our foundational beliefs about what we do and why. I want to start by talking about stories, and why I called it a new story. Basically, being a human being means you tell stories. You tell stories about where you come from, where you're going, how you understand what's happened to you, what your hopes are for the future. In fact, it is argued, and I agree, that the ability not only to tell a story, to make sense of your life, but also, crucially, to be heard and recognised is absolutely core to being able to live well in the world. And that when you have troubles and difficulties, that being able to understand them, make sense of them, and tell that story to somebody is really, really crucial, and for them to hear it, not to appropriate it, not to colonize it, not to give it their own words, to hear it and to respect it. And the reason that I'm so passionate about the fact that we need to do better is that I carry with me every day the stories of mothers and fathers and young people, the stories of people who've been in the child protection system and who tell me that when they told a story of shame, of hurt, of disappointment, of trouble, of violence, that story was often returned to them in an unrecognisable form, that it was returned to them in a form that talked about risk, that talked about categories, and that talked about outcomes. That story became something else. And I just want to tell you very briefly, because she made a huge impact upon me, about Julia. I was interviewing Julia for some work I was doing for the Family Rights Group, and she cried all through the interview. Julia had been her story will be very familiar to you. She'd been in care, she'd been sexually abused at home, and she also had a very difficult time in care. She married a violent man. She had the courage and the strength to separate from him, and then she went into depression. She rang Children's Services and she asked them for help, and they placed her children on a child protection plan. She said to me, "I've been bullied all my life, and this is more of it. I'm not a danger to my children." And her story was returned to her in a way that made her feel ashamed, but also angry and sad. And I think that we need to think about what we do with people's stories. Generally, on a policy level, there is real interest in storytelling at the minute, and real interest, I think we cannot but live in this world, those of us who would say we're on the progressive side of politics, and not think, how have things gone so wrong? 2016 was the year that the word post-truth, or words post-truth, was selected by the Oxford English Dictionary as the word of the year. And what it referred to was the way in which stories that seemed to bear very little reality to evidence or truth or what was really going on not only circulated, but were really, really successful. So we had the election of Donald Trump, and we had in my country the success of Brexit based on lies, really. And so people have been thinking, well, if we can't go out there with the facts or the evidence and get people to believe us, well, what hope is there? And people like me who do research, who spend my life trying to understand what's going on, what are we going to do? How are we going to engage people? How are we going to get them to listen to us? It's a very, very challenging project at the minute. And so many of us have turned to people like George Lakoff, and some of you may know his work, and he has talked about framing. He's talked about the way in which, when we start to give statistics to people or evidence to people, some people are able to hear it because it fits with their pre-existing frame about how they see the world. So when I say, the majority of people in poverty in England today are working, lots and lots of my mates say, oh yeah, I know. But if I say it to another group of people, they will say, well, they're not maybe working hard enough, or they haven't got the right qualifications, or they should go back and study and get better jobs. So there are different oppositional frames, and just hoping that you as an academic, or you as a policymaker, or you in the Australian Institute of Family Studies can go out there and tell them this is what we found, that it'll change hearts and minds. That's not the way things work. It's not the way human beings process information, and it's also not the way, in fact, we develop our own moral identity as part of particular kinds of tribes or groups. And so there's become a real interest across the piece in how do we tell stories that are rooted in the evidence, that are ethical, but that grab people, that compel them to think differently and compel them to change. It's allegedly suggested that all compelling stories have a plot, that they feature heroes, they feature villains, that they have a moral, and crucially, that they're rooted in a set of values. And I would argue, and I have looked at this a lot because I've been, as I was telling my colleagues the other day, I've been the lead on impact for a large project called the Child Welfare Inequalities Project. And it's been my job to go out there and ensure that the research was heard and had an impact. So it obliged me not only to find people to talk to, but to actually think about how I talked to them, to think about the words I used, to think about the frames I used. And that obliged me to come back and look at what the frames they were currently using to understand child protection. So, and this is at its most basic. This is the current framing, at its most basic. Basically, we think that child abuse and neglect are intrafamilial generally, and that they're usually caused by things that parents do and carers do or don't do. Neglect, physical abuse, sexual abuse, etc. We struggle with things, actually, that are outside an intrafamilial frame. Child sexual exploitation, for example, adolescents who are getting themselves into all sorts of difficulties. We struggle to understand that within the frame. We manage to accommodate it, but it can often be very tricky. A key part of the professional task is to assess for and to deal with risks in individual families, to go out in the car, to visit the family, to go into the home, to look at what is or isn't happening, to assess the context in which people are living their lives in the home. It's a highly individualised project. Getting the assessment of risk right and communicating appropriately with the other agencies, making sure you share information. We've been told this endlessly in England, that the reason children die is we didn't talk to each other. We didn't provide information. That generally will save children. So you have victims and villains, you have a plot, you have a moral, and you have heroes. This appeals to important values. It's argued generally by researchers that there are about 54 core values that are kind of distributed differently across societies, but that are shared generally, but they're distributed differently. So you have a cluster of values that are around individuals, around ambition, around looking after oneself, looking after one's family. There are a cluster of values that are more other-oriented, that are more about looking after the earth, looking after society, more solidaristic, communitarian. They're not fixed. Societies can move from one set of values to another, and people can move from one set of values to another. Values are very important to people. They're crucially why we do what we do. But as I say, they're not fixed. This story fits with important values. I'm not dismissing those values at all. In fact, I would say if I want to change people, and there is a lot of evidence to suggest this, I need to take what they're saying and what they're believing and what they're trying to do extremely seriously and respected. The values are around protecting the vulnerable, protecting those who have no voice often, babies and little children, trying to make a better world for them and ensuring that we don't repeat the horrible, horrible injustices of a world where children were not heard, where children were perhaps seen but they weren't heard, and they certainly had no voice or agency. However, that framing is being troubled, and I've been part of a very small part of work in England and in the UK generally and across the world that is starting to say that framing has huge problems. And I want to talk about 4 areas that are troubling it. So first of all, I want to talk about a growing evidence base in relation to the issues that are not dealt with in that frame, that are invisible, crucially poverty and inequality. I want to talk about the interest that is growing, and I mean, we've always been interested in ethics, but perhaps in a kind of what works context, we've often become rather instrumental and outcome-focused in a very narrow way, and I'll come back to why I think evidence is really, really important, and what works is really part of an ethical project, but cannot colonize an ethical project. And I will talk about my experience of working on an adoption inquiry and what we've found out about ethics and the importance of engaging in ethical conversations and ethical dialogue. The other thing that's troubling that framing and is very dear to the heart of this conference and to the concerns of this conference is that those who experience services are telling us all the time now in different ways that it isn't working for them. Some bits are, but lots of it aren't. And in particular, we are hearing in England and in the UK more generally, we are hearing from voices that have been silenced hitherto. We are hearing from the mothers who've lost their children, the mothers who've been silenced, who have been tormented by disenfranchised grief, the mothers who cannot go to the Citizens Advice Bureau and explain why they need different kinds of benefit advice, who can't explain why their children aren't living with them. We are starting to hear from them, and they are helped and supported and working in collaboration with an expanded cast of new storytellers, from journalists, from women, journalists who've been energised by the Me Too campaign and by the evidence that we know of violence towards women across the world, who see what's happening in the child protection system, from lawyers, from social workers, academics, and generally. So I will go through those 4 and give you some evidence and ideas about how the framing is being troubled. And then hopefully I will talk about how we can construct a new story and what we are saying in our new book, which comes out in September too, on Protecting Children, a Social Model. Okay, this is a graph that is from published data. It tells us the rates of children who are in care per 10,000 aged 0 to 17 in 2016 in the UK. That graph at the top is Glasgow. I'm sure lots of people here have been to Glasgow or have relatives in Glasgow or have had background from Glasgow, knowing people in Australia. That is not unusual. 312 children per 10,000 in Glasgow are looked after. What's going on there? Social workers doing a really good job, they're doing a really bad job. Are parents really struggling with attachment patterns in Glasgow? Are they really struggling with parenting capacity? Right down to Wokingham, which is a very rich part of Berkshire in the south of England, where there are 22 children per 10,000 looked after in the local authority. These are big differences. How can we make sense of them? In the current framing, I would suggest we struggle. And in fact, in the current framing, this kind of graph wouldn't be put up. Because in the current framing, the explanations for why children are having troubles, why they're maltreated, why their parents are dealing poorly with them, is routinely seen through a very individual gaze. It's a gaze about what happens in this home, Not on this street, not in this neighbourhood, not in this community, but this home. What happens to the child's brain, what happens to internal cognitions, what people's thinking patterns are, what their learning patterns are, their learned patterns of violence, the dynamics between families, the dynamics between men and women in the families. And the explanations for the interactions by the state or by the services are usually, in the UK anyway, the reason that there are such differences must be that they're doing different types of practice in Glasgow, so we need to change practice. It's that they have poor practice leadership, that they're using thresholds differently. The thresholds are big in one place and they're low in another, or that there are differences between the courts. The judges are different. Now, actually, there's a grain of truth, of course there is, in all of this. There are variations between the courts. As we heard yesterday from some of the people from New South Wales, changing practice, changing how we talk to families makes a huge difference. It's really, really important. We're not denying any of that. What we're saying is, though, there is a big, big piece of this picture missing. So, bringing in a different frame. I've been lucky enough to be part of a project called the Child Welfare and Equalities Project, which interestingly emerged from the thinking of somebody who had never done a child protection visit in his life. He'd been a social worker for years and years and years, but his interest was in health inequalities. He'd spent his life thinking about why, what's going on when men in one part of the country die 10 years earlier. How does social work with that? What's going on when you have such huge discrepancies in different types of illnesses and also, of course, in mental health issues. So he'd come at it from a more systemic frame and a more systematic frame. And he had discovered something about variations and differences that made him come to a great number of us across the UK, people who were doing research on child protection, and say, hey, do you think I'm onto something here? Can we get some money? And can we look at what's happening across the UK in terms of the links between deprivation and children's chances of coming into care? Is there something about the poverty and child protection that we need to look at? This hadn't been looked at for years in the UK and was quite revolutionary. It had been really quite a silenced issue. This is, to cut a very long story short, LAC is looked after. This is, in broad terms, what we found after £500,000 later, lots and lots of very big case studies, lots and lots of quantitative data covering the 4 countries. We found that in England, by deprivation quintile, children in quintile 1, which is the rich bit of the country, 13 per 10,000 were likely to be looked after, whereas if you went to quintile 5, 112. So if you break that down actually into deciles, i.e. the 10th most deprived area, what you find is that that children in the most deprived 10% of neighbourhoods were over 10 times more likely to be looked after than children in the least deprived local areas. Wales, very high differences as well, and Scotland were off the roof altogether. I mean, Scotland, it was a really big shock for colleagues in Scotland for all sorts of reasons. This was not what they thought they were doing, and so it was it provoked quite a lot of discussion. So broadly speaking, what it also said is in the most deprived neighbourhoods then, roughly 1 child in 60 was likely to be in care. And in the least deprived bit of our country, it was 1 child in 660. What we also found was it wasn't a question of the poor versus the rest. What we found was there was a gradient. It was like a ladder. For each 10% increase in deprivation, there was an increase in looked after children rates of about 30%. But we know that the stats don't change people's minds. But that is and so my job as the person who was the lead on impact for this project was to think about how I could talk about those stats. But before I did, let's look at another piece of work that came along at the same time and was very influenced by ours, and there was a synergy between it. Some people maybe from Western Australia may have heard of Andy Bilson. He's done a lot of work in Western Australia, and he's in the UK at the minute. And he has been looking at what he calls the investigative turn. And that is, he first of all just looked at broad figures. He did freedom of information requests. And what he found is that 1 in every 5 children in the population in England, 1 in every 5, had been referred to social care before the age of 5. 1 in every 9 was suspected of being abused, and 1 in every 19 was formally investigated. I've put all the references for all this stuff at the end of the slide, so you can read, because one of his arguments is that all this activity, is it leading to help? Are people actually getting any help? Or are we just simply investigating? He then went, having looked at our figures on the interactions in terms of being looked after and deprivation, he then went and took those figures from the general population and he applied them to deprived populations. And he found in an average class of 35-year-olds in the deprived areas, 14 children would have been referred to children's social care. And at the other end of the scale, children in the least deprived 10%, a similar class might include only 1 child who had been referred to children's services or been in need. So what we started to think with this evidence base was we were building up a picture of communities in our country where large numbers of children, their first encounter, apart from maybe health visiting, their first encounter with the state was through a child protection investigation. There were large numbers of children who were receiving social work visits on a regular basis, and there were large numbers of communities and neighbourhoods and families where children were leaving and moving out of the community. And a lot of this was invisible, was silenced, and was being experienced by people, particularly mothers, as deeply shameful and as an individual issue. I've already identified that there were differences in terms of rates of removal between children in particular areas. When I started to map those inequalities between the boys in Blackpool and the boys in Wokingham, when I started to map them onto other areas of inequalities, such as mental health issues or life expectancy, I found that the boys in Blackpool who are more likely to be removed were more likely also to have their dads die 10 years earlier than the boys in places like Wokingham. That places like Blackpool, a decaying seaside town whose good days are very far behind it in many ways, that it had the highest level of prescription drugs in the whole country and highest rates of self-reported mental health. So, but that those links were not made, that what we were having was a child protection frame where the same conversations, the same visits were being done by social workers to individual houses and individual people in Blackpool as they were to individual houses in Wokingham. That there was a menu of programmes, Triple P, Signs of Safety, there were a menu of programmes that were available and that were being applied irrespective of context, irrespective of what it was like to be a young mum in Blackpool or a young mum in Wokingham, irrespective of how these things differed or didn't. The implications of the spirit level, and I haven't got time to go into that now, say that it isn't just about poverty, that there is, as Robert Walker's work suggests, that every country that he has looked at, from countries like Norway that have fantastically well-developed welfare systems, to countries like Uganda, where very much less so, in every country, poverty carries shame. But it is particularly shameful, according to Wilkinson and Piggott, in countries that are deeply unequal. The countries like mine, which are deeply unequal, are likely to have high levels of division, high levels of distrust, high levels of high degree of lack of cohesion, but crucially, all the things we deal with as individualised issues in child protection, high levels of mental health difficulties, substance misuse difficulties, drug and alcohol problems, and high levels of violence. All the things that are actually, I would suggest, socially generated, but yes, individually experienced. They are dealt with, though, within an individual frame, and we think it's time for a change. So, engaging with ethics. This follows on quite nicely because one of the things we were studying was the interaction of the state with deprived populations. And so we were turning the gaze away from what people do or don't do, how much they drink or how much they don't drink, how they do or don't talk to their children, and we're turning the gaze on ourselves. What are we doing when we're going out to deal with these social problems? And it seemed to us that we had a menu of assess, investigate, and remove. This is a little too simplistic, but that there was a bit of a menu, and that there was a limited menu of therapeutic projects, etc. Then, by coincidence, if you like, I got involved in, I commissioned myself. I didn't commission myself. I wish I did. I wish I could commission myself. That would be great. All my money problems solved, all my funding issues. Just give yourself £1 million. I bid for a piece of work with Professor Anna Gupta, who is actually from this parish and did her first degree at Monash, and would love to be here, actually. And, of course, I had to tell her on the phone last night that I knew more about Australia because I'd been here a day than she did, having grown up and lived here, when she tried to tell me something. I said, oh, no, I know all about that now. There you go. That's what jet lag does to you. But quite seriously, Anna and I were... we were commissioned to do an inquiry into the role of the social worker in adoption, ethics and human rights. This was a really unique opportunity. It was a really unique thing for the British Association of Social Workers to do. It has tended to be, in the past, it's changing, but it's tended to be it certainly didn't commission research. It certainly was a little bit more anxious and conservative in the past. It didn't always attract social workers very much, but it's got this kind of real get up and go at the minute. It's got all sorts of people joining it, and it's developing a really strong, vibrant engagement with the government and with social workers. Their Policy, Ethics and Human Rights Committee were looking at what was happening in England and Wales, but particularly in England, post-2010, and they were saying, to cut a very long story short, we've always had adoption. There have been strong policy pushes on adoption at different times. Under New Labour, we had a strong policy push, and we had targets and a whole range of things to promote adoption. At that time, I would say maybe there wasn't the same level of anxiety about it, because we also, at the same time, under New Labour, had a massive amount of spending on family support. So we could see that birth families were getting a lot of support. We also had a great deal of spending on children who were in care, on quality protects for them, so that children who were in residential care or fostering care had their teeth looked after, went to the opticians, there was a lot, their education was looked after, a lot of work went into schools. So we could see that there was a kind of, if you like, balanced portfolio under Labour. And certainly for me personally, I wasn't really struggling with the fact that they were promoting adoption. It wasn't really as much on my radar, because I thought that they were developing a whole range of things to deal with family troubles. Okay, oh my goodness, yeah, right. So very quickly, we came into a different space post-2010, family support cut, and adoption became promoted as the gold standard, as the best thing, the only thing, by the Prime Minister and the then Minister. When we engaged with the inquiry, we engaged with social workers, some of whom said to us, we're not interested in this inquiry. For us, it's about outcomes. Adoption is the best outcome for children, to which we answered, it's not quite that settled. It's all about the child. And we're there to make sure that the child has a good outcome. However, we found many social workers who gave evidence to our inquiry who were doing what Sarah Banks has called ethics work, really quite concerned about the context in which they were doing their job. They weren't anti-adoption at all, but they were worried about it being pushed. They were worried about it being done in a context where they weren't sure that every family, particularly birth families, were getting what they needed to thrive and flourish. We found evidence of ethical unease from managers. We found evidence of something called moral distress, where people felt that they were being blocked by the lack of resources, by austerity, from doing what they thought was the right thing. We found evidence of ethical trespass, where people weren't getting the time to mull over what was right to do. They were being pushed in particular directions with no acknowledgement of the inevitable possibility of harm. And we found that there wasn't a strong discourse of human rights, but that when it was introduced, it offered some possibilities for thinking beyond a kind of cul-de-sac of it's right to not delay things, and it's right to keep children at home, etc., kind of cul-de-sac arguments. finally. So very quickly, I have way run out of time, we found also, as I said, challenges from those who experience services. You won't be surprised at all. It's very well known that care-experienced people have been saying to us for a long time, your services don't work for us. In the care inquiry, I was terribly struck by a young person who said, why am I always having to say goodbye? Why are you always breaking up my relationships? I only get settled in one place and you move me on. I only get settled with one worker and she leaves. Systems can do offer rupture rather than repair. This is terribly important in the context of the evidence that we now have on loneliness. Our systems are reproducing often loneliness. We're saying to women, leave him. We're saying to children, you've got to move on now, you're 18. Go into a flat. Previously unheard, we're now hearing from parents in poverty who hung their heads in shame through the collaborations we're having with the ATD Fourth World, an international organisation that works with parents in poverty and has now made links with us in the child protection system. Academics of Royal Holloway, people like Anna, have been working for years with parents, getting them to tell their stories about poverty and shame. This is not quick fix, this is stuff that's been going on a long time. A relationship between poverty and shame is being made visible. Many of our systems reproduce the shame. We make people beg for their bus fares. We make people, we don't take account of the fact that they miss work because they have to come to our meetings. This is very challenging in a neoliberal climate because everything has become so individualised. Rebecca Solnit is, I don't know if people know her. Well, I've never met her in my life, but I am madly in love with her writing. And I would probably be struck down if I ever met her. She's written a great, she actually, I am sorry, I'm going to go over a little here, but she's actually, as far as I know, she's the woman for whom the term mansplaining is attached to. Because she was at a party one night and this guy was telling her all about this great thing he'd been reading. And then he said to her, have you read it? And she said, yes, I wrote it. And he continued to tell her what this thing said. So she's written two great books. One is called Hope in the Dark. It's absolutely brilliant. And the other is about domestic abuse and the Me Too campaign. And this is a quote, and I can't read it out to you, but about even being able to say, I need help, but being able to say, I need help when you're in danger, and the ways in which, how difficult it is to tell that story and to be heard. And just very quickly, Kim is a mother who we worked with on the adoption inquiry, who has had a child adopted, with whom she has letterbox contact. We don't have direct contact, usually, apart from Northern Ireland. It's letterbox contact, which can be very erratic. But she does have a child now who lives with her. Her partner was violent, her father was violent. Her understanding is that her child was removed because of her history of violence. She's furious about it. She's grief-stricken and she's furious. She feels she's been punished for having a violent father and partner. She worries about the future. She worries about the fact that she needs to go back to work because of our benefit system. And she worries that she won't be able to do. She wanted to be a children's nurse. She says to me, who'd ever train me now with my background? I'm a danger to children, haven't I? Money is a constant worry. Okay, she is, and this is the hopeful bit, she is an active member of Mothers Living Apart from Their Children. It's an organisation that we did a lot of work with in the inquiry, and these are women who have lost their children for whatever reason or who are not living with their children, and through careful patient work with the support worker, they now go out and they train adoptive parents about the importance of keeping that letterbox contact, about the importance of keeping that last meeting. They put a human face to birth mothers and they tell their stories in a really hopeful and helpful way. Right. Okay. I'll finish that. So there are an expanded cast of storytellers. David Tobis's book from the US tells us that even in the worst of times in New York, when crack-addicted Hispanic mothers were losing their children to the child protection system, one strike and you were definitely out, how with patient help, with workers, with sociologists, with lawyers, they were able to turn around and now turn the story around. And now New York has a really strong system of parent advocates. Those same mothers help other mothers through the child protection system. And his book is called From Pariahs to Partners. So, a new story. As Rebecca says, changing the story isn't enough in itself. You have to make visible the injuries, but you also have to keep talking about the story. You have to find new people to tell it, and you have to make sure that new people, including those who've been excluded, can be heard. Stories need to be rooted in evidence, but not in a really, really fixed and rigid way. The evidence changes. We need to be open to the possibility that things are not fixed. It needs to be rooted in values. We need to use metaphor, capture people's imagination, engender a sense of hope and the possibility of change. And it needs to be told by good storytellers. But this can be subject to manipulation. This can be about, like, the people who are the most articulate, who can pull at the heartstrings most, can do the most manipulative. But, and you'll be glad to know, Anne, that I have got the word dangerous in. It's not that everything is bad, Foucault said, it's that everything is dangerous. There are no good choices often. We have to try things out. So I do think it is worth trying to craft good stories. Very, 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 very finally, we are trying to craft a new story. It's called the social model. We want to get away from the individualism of the current child protection. We borrowed from mental health. We want to talk about the economic, the environmental, the cultural barriers that are faced by families. And we have a whole range of things in our story about what we need to do. I want to give the last word because it fits beautifully with what Anne said about the end of the panel. She said Australia needs to talk about what kind of society it wants to be. Dingwall and all in 1983, over 30 years ago, said child protection is not a matter of finding better checklists or new models of psychopathology. It's not a matter of technical fixes. The proper decision is a decision about what constitutes a good society for families and for children. Thank you very much.
I'm going to ask the first one, then I would love you to take over. But I'm sitting there and I'm not an expert, and I'm wondering, you're not talking about child protection, are you? You're talking about protecting children, which is a change in the narrative itself.
Yeah. And I'm not even that happy about the term protecting children, but we chose this in preference to the term child protection is too rigid. It's like talking about the family. What protects children are activities, are things we do as a society, are things we do as people. It's not about having something granite-like and forbidding and towering up there called the system that has procedures and has plans and has systems and has checklists. It's about something active. It's about something that we do every day. It's about the fact that I don't turn a blind eye when I hear my next door neighbour shouting at the kids. It's about me going around and saying, are you all right? Can I do anything? It's about action. It's about practices.
Okay, our first question. Thank you, Matt.
Hello, thank you very much for that. My name's Sue Tregeagle from Barnardo's, Australia, and we're an agency that has really tried to keep poverty on the map here for years and been politely and sometimes not so politely, told that this is no longer acceptable to talk about. So I was really interested to know why you think that a previous well-established kind of social policy was so firmly put underground. And also some thoughts about because what I found is that the complexity of trying to talk about poverty and disadvantage is that it's a bit too, that downward spiral is really quite hard for people to get their heads around. What's cause, what's effect? And I don't know how to communicate that in a way that's meaningful.
Thank you, Brigid.
Yeah, I mean, you've raised absolutely core issues here, but by the way, don't romanticise certainly England. It is not somewhere that's very well established social policy-wise anymore. And I could go on and on about what's happened to us, particularly since 2010, in terms of the destitution, actually, not just the poverty, but the destitution that many people are in. It's a huge task. When we started going around saying, we think that our statistics are saying this, people were saying to us, you are insulting to poor people. You are saying not all poor people abuse their children. This is offensive. It's very hard. It's very hard to explain that poverty is something active. It's something that interacts with people's choices, their decisions every day. It's something that is not inert. It's kind of part of, like, from the minute you get up thinking about, well, what am I going to do about the fact that it's the kid's birthday? What am I going to do? I'm dreading Christmas. It's about the fact that their children are coming home saying that they want certain things. It's about all that kind of stress which is already placed on people who are already struggling. I think one of the things that's changed a bit, the story, is that the services have been so badly starved of money themselves now. The cuts have been horrendous, and they've fallen particularly on the most deprived local authorities. 27% cuts in the most deprived local authorities compared to 4% in the richer ones. And it has started to become unsustainable to say, we need money for our services, and not acknowledge that money is really, the cuts are really impacting upon the people that they're dealing with. And the level of demand has grown and grown and grown. But it's a really uphill battle. We had social workers say to us quite seriously that they would signpost people to food banks, but it wasn't core business. Core business was assessing parenting capacity. And so but just to end on a note of hope, Northern Ireland has just brought out an anti-poverty practice framework for social workers that's been pioneered by their chief social worker. Michal Kumar-Nevo in Israel has developed this really important poverty-aware paradigm which social workers in Israel are using, and where there's a whole range of things that they're doing in practice. Because the key thing, quite rightly, directors will say to us, oh, you academics are great at criticising us. What do we do in practice? Tell us what to do. So, and there are examples now of how you can actually do things in practice.
Thank you, Brigid. Our next question up the back. Thanks, ma'am. Yeah.
Hi, I have a question coming from a social work background, and I love your talk, and I get it. In social work, we're all about context and the importance of that, the person, the environment approach. And yet, politically and economically, we get reduced to single answers. And your talk reminds me of a TED Talk called The Danger of a Single Story.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So
yeah.
So what do you see as any sort of hope for a pathway to deal with those political and economic pressures, which are, oh, we've rediscovered poverty, and then it gets reduced to a certain number of items, or, can you fix this quickly, and so on.
Yeah.
Do you see ways, maybe because of the changing political climate, or ways to, not get reduced again?
Yeah, I have to say that TED Talk, we use it a lot, that the danger of a single story. We use it a lot to talk about the dangers of seeing adoption in one way, actually. It's a brilliant, brilliant TED Talk. Lakoff says, George Lakoff talks about the fact that, that conservatives are very good at using something that's very familiar to us, which is the direct causation frame. So we grow up from babyhood onwards with our mothers saying, don't put your hand against the fire, you'll get burnt. And indeed you will. There is a direct link between you putting your hand on the fire and getting burnt. Most social issues are not, they're systemic caused. It's really hard, and academics are crap at it. We're awful at saying, oh, it's really complex. It could be this or it could be that, and blah, blah, blah. That's why we need multiple storytellers, and we need action on a range of levels. So we need the parents. I have stood with very embittered, grim managers sitting there, hands folded, all that kind of thing. And I have watched parents talk about the decisions they have to make every day around, say, coming to contact to their children, how many buses they get, how much time it costs, etc., etc. But that can only be one bit of the piece. We have to have a multi-pronged approach, and it is a hard journey. It's a hard journey, and sometimes you will get politicians who will listen. They're not all the same.
Thank you. Up the back on my right. Thank you. Yes.
Thanks for the presentation. Kirsty Nolan from the Every Child campaign. I wanted you to reflect a little bit more on what you said in response to Anne's first question. So this notion of whether part of telling a new story is actually stepping away from the idea of protecting children as the dominant narrative, because obviously it places us in the deficit framework. And at the moment, protecting children allocates responsibility to the service system. And the point you've made so eloquently is that the service system isn't the answer to the problems we're assessing. And so I wondered if there was part of the reframing that needed to be around that question of who is actually responsible and how we construct the issue. We heard yesterday that we want that families are about love, care and support. These are very positive terms. So could you reflect on that a little?
Yeah, it's the slide I had to leave out. Basically, very quickly, what we argue in our book is, first of all, that we have to tackle root causes. If we're going to have a social model, we have to tackle root causes, poverty and inequality, causes of sexual violence, etc. The second thing we say is we have to rethink the role of the state. There is a really, really, really vital role for the state at a national level in terms of social protections, in terms of health, education, all those things that are being eroded as citizenship entitlements. But we do, and we do think that local states, which is the way ours is organised, has a really important role to play in thinking and working together to think about what's it like for families in this city, what's the bus service like, but incorporating all the things that we care about in child protection. What's it like for young fathers here? Who do they talk to, etc. But we say, and we're really clear about this, we have to also acknowledge that the state is not a neutral, benign force, that marginalised populations have had very, very poor histories with it, and also that there is something on a more positive level. We call it relationships-based practice and co-production. Our view is that we've outsourced child protection to the state and to social workers. So when I do hear the person next door, she's shouting at the kids, what I do is I pick up the phone and I ring Children's Services and say she's not coping. We do say that if we really, really want to build sustainable services, if we really want to build good societies, there is no road back from a really long, big job, which is rebuilding and supporting community capacity. And in England, that is a really big challenge in some of our communities. Some of our most deprived communities have been really scarred by austerity, have been really scarred by fragmentation and by divisiveness. People are suspicious of each other. There's lots and lots of... Yeah, anyway, I won't go on. So, but you're getting, I would have loved to have talked more about that. It's something I feel really passionate about. I don't really think it's about building good services. It's about building good societies. And services are only one small part of it. To give you a really quick example, we've had a project that's been working very intensively with mothers who've had a number of children removed, and looked on the surface to have very good outcomes. When I went back to talk to the social workers a little bit later, some of those women had gone on to have more children and have them removed. Their success hadn't been sustained. And I just thought, did anyone think about maybe setting up some peer support between them afterwards? Maybe think about how you sustained some kind of like ongoing social capital. There is really some very good... The Freedom Programme, for example, that works with domestic abuse. Very user-led, very quick, very kind of user-friendly. They have built-in support systems afterwards, which is about the women helping each other, not about endless amounts of services, which will be withdrawn the minute there's a bit of austerity anyway.
How do you think change will happen? Will it be led from the industry, from the people who need the services, or do you think it'll be a proactive country or government that moves in this way?
Do you know, if I could answer that, I'd be very rich. I don't know.
Are you hopeful that it could happen?
I'm hopeful, actually. I am hopeful about small. I am hopeful that some of the local authority... I live in Yorkshire. Leeds City is fantastic. It's a child-friendly city. It's developed and pioneered restorative approaches to families. It has a very different feel about it in terms of how its workers do. I am hopeful that cities like that, if concede more broad... And I talked to the director about this, if they develop anti-poverty strategies, if they develop more engagement with communities, I think, and then we'll all go, oh, that's really interesting, and we'll maybe learn some from that. But I think it's more small things.
A last question before we let you go. You played a role in ensuring research has an impact. You looked at that in a lot of detail. To people in this room, what's the tip? How do we ensure what we do, the research we do, the work we do, actually does have the impact it should?
Well, I don't think there is a kind of like rule, and I do think I was reflecting on this last night when I couldn't sleep, and I was thinking about the fact that, there's lots of great research that's done, but it's at the wrong time, or it's the wrong government, or, but I do think that you have to plan. One of the things we did in the Child Welfare and Equalities Project is we allocated, we allocated a senior person in the team to impact, and I had a massive Excel sheet, and I had mapped every single person that I thought we needed to talk to, every single stakeholder, and we reviewed it constantly. And I went away and read. I read loads of things, because it wasn't something I knew much about. How do you communicate? How do you talk to people? And so I became really fascinated by all of this. And then I found that lots of people, as is always the way, lots of people, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, the National NSPCC, the whole range of organisations were in the same game, because we're all feeling equally frustrated.
Ladies and gentlemen, a big round of applause for Brigid Featherstone.